Arlie, I'm so excited to talk to you because I think so much of what you've written about, so much of what you continue to write about resonates deeply today because I think you went out to explore what everyone is now asking. Why are we so divided? Why do we seem like two different countries? And I think your work really answers those questions. First, with a book you wrote previously called Strangers in Their Own Land, and now a new book called Stolen Pride. I want to start at the beginning of this journey, though, if I could. What set you out on this path to understand what was happening really in Red America?
Uh, I think already with before Trump was elected in 16, there was the growth of the Tea Party, and the whole idea that you don't really need government services. Well, let's just cut taxes and cut the services. And it wasn't so I thought, wait a minute, there's something I haven't been looking at. And I would like to see family leave for new parents. I would like to see uh, the government doing something about homelessness, a lot of social problems that need to be addressed. And there was a group of people that was saying no. So that's what got me going first to the Deep South, to Lake Charles, Louisiana, and most recently um, for the new book, Stolen Pride, to Appalachia, to the uh, whitest and second poorest congressional district in the country, where I met some amazing people, but did begin to understand what um, why it was so many Americans were um, had open ears to what a charismatic figure uh, was coming to offer. Yeah, I feel in a way as if America is now living with two denials. There's the denial of the Democratic side of America that's saying, who are these people? How silly of them to vote for Donald Trump. And and then so that's really denying what a big sector of America that has faced tremendous loss and has lost faith in the government as a response to that loss. There's a denial of the Democratic side of America of that whole loss story. And I think we have a big job ahead to um, address that. But there's a denial on the right side of the aisle, on Republicans, that they may have voted for a man for one reason: control the border, or the price of gas. But uh, we are facing, I think, a danger to democracy. And I think there is a discounting and a denial of that on the right side of America. So I think we've got two denials. We need to work on both.
You're a sociologist from the University of California at Berkeley. I mean, when people think of a job and a place, they couldn't describe a more liberal background. And it reminds me of the ad, like, what's a nice girl like you doing in a place like this? I don't even know what it was for, but it became a family joke in my household. And I used to say that all the time. My parents would laugh and laugh. But you were, as a sociologist at Berkeley, you are from this liberal enclave traveling to these deep red parts of the country. First, Louisiana for your book, Strangers in Their Own Land, sort of the center of the petrochemical industry.
Right?
And now with Stolen Pride, you travel to, as you said, Appalachia or Appalachia. Which one is it, by the way?
Appalachia.
Appalachia, to really examine what was going on with young men in this country in particular. So let's start with why you went to Appalachia in the first place, why that was ground zero for your new book.
Well, let me just say first that it I love what I do, and, I invite anyone else. There's nothing special about being a person from a liberal, uh, part of the country, uh, and you really miss out if you don't learn to take your alarm system off and listen, because 'cause you'll meet some extraordinary people, and you'll have actually a lot in common with them. So it's no big fence to jump over, and people ask me, "Oh, how did you do that?" And I think, "Oh, goodness, people are missing a big opportunity to really get to know people who are ultimately your neighbors in this country." And the people on the other side are as worried about our divide as we are. So that's the first thing to say. Um, but what led me uh, to this is a fear that we were becoming divided. And already 10 years ago, 15, there were signs of a stretch going on. And I feel a little bit like the crow in the top of the tree. Hey, something's coming. Look out. Um, and I like being that crow.
I love the fact that you described something called an empathy wall, and you really look at sociology and society writ large from an emotional point of view. Why are people feeling a certain way? And I think you lead with that.
Yeah.
Why?
Well, thank you for the question, Katie, because um, I actually believe that we all need to become bilingual, that we're used to speaking just the language of rationality. And what we need to do is to be able to hear and speak in emotions because there's a curious uh, logic to emotions. There are emotional scripts. And there are a whole different story unfolds if we look at emotions. We are emotional creatures. We feel fear. We feel distress. We feel envy. And in my last book, I feel that we also feel pride and shame, and that unless we're listening to that, we're not seeing the whole story. It and actually, it feels like the main story. Because why is it the main story? It's the main story because if we go back, there's a backstory. If we go back uh, 2 decades and we look at 3 decades, look at NAFTA, offshoring, automation, that has created the haves and the have nots of globalization. And so the haves who live in cities, who have BAs, uh, for whom new opportunities are have opened up, aren't looking at the situation of loss. It's not just deprivation, but loss of actually the white blue collar class. It's lost absolutely and relative to BA whites and relative actually to blacks with or without BAs. So that's a lost story. And uh, people I came to know are very proud people. And they, even when they're desperately poor, as in Appalachia, uh, they have long been, they're proud of how they've survived poverty, how they've imaginatively coped with poverty. And that pride has been lost. So I think why it's important to focus on lost pride on, is that a lot of people, most of the people I've talked to have given up on mainstream governments, Republican or Democrat. They have not found answers to their pressing problems. They are frightened that either, um, you know, women and blacks will compete with them, drive them down further internally, or that immigrants will come in, take those good jobs and government services. So they feeling frightened and a sense of loss. So they have turned to a charismatic figure who works through emotions. And that's that's why it's important. I believe, for example, that Donald Trump has they were predisposed to look for an answer to their pressing needs and fears and shame, unwarranted, unwelcome shame. And Trump, I think, uh, has answered it. I think actually, as a person, he's experienced shame, a very harsh father, and that would be neither here nor there, except that it's given him enormous insight into the pain of unwarranted shame that a lot of blue collar men who feel in free fall have felt. And he, I think, offers a 4-moment anti shaming ritual that, unless we are bilingual, we don't hear. And moment one, for example, and it happens repeatedly through different episodes, but moment one of this anti shaming ritual is Donald Trump will say something transgressive, like Asian immigrants are uh, cooking and eating your pet cats and dogs. Okay, moment two, the punditry shames Donald Trump and says, you can't say that. I mean, there was one article, but it turns out it's not true, and you don't repeat something that isn't true. Okay, so the punditry shames Donald Trump. Moment three, Donald Trump becomes the victim of the shamers. Look how hard it is to be put down, to be vilified. And have you been put down? Have they put you down too? Yeah, well, they're putting me down. I'm actually taking the hit for you.
That's fascinating because a
And the
lot of
point,
people wonder, how can people who are struggling financially aspire or admire someone like Donald Trump, who is so wealthy and so ostentatious and lives a life so completely different than they do? But you're talking about this shame sharing thing that happens that
absolutely.
makes them gravitate towards someone that it's kind of a microcosm of what they're feeling daily in their lives.
Exactly, Katie. Exactly. Bingo. And moment four, he gets revenge for the shaming. He tells them off. He turns shame to blame.
That is fascinating. Well, let's get back to stolen pride because, well, this is really what we're talking about. But you ended up in Pike County, Kentucky, the nation's, as you mentioned, whitest and second poorest congressional district, which, by the way, is just a few hours from where J.D. Vance wrote Hillbilly Elegy.
That's right. That's right.
Well, that's
Um,
really an interesting psychological turnabout that we can maybe discuss another time. But Stolen Pride focuses on a period of time in 2017 leading up to a planned rally by a white supremacist named Matthew Heimbach. And you actually got to know him during the course of writing this book. And you basically start with Matthew Heimbach and another figure in Pikeville who is trying to figure out whether or not to give Matthew Heimbach's organization a permit to protest in Pikeville. Tell us about these two individuals and why you focused on them initially in your book.
I focused on them initially in my book because I saw a perfect storm. On the one hand, coal jobs had gone out, opiates, big crisis ongoing, have come in. And then there was a neo-Nazi march promising a false, I think, answer to those problems. This is all white, so blame blacks. So I thought I was looking at a perfect storm. And so I decided to, again, alarm system off, listen to the perpetrator, listen to those who are trying to protect the community against violence that Matthew Heimbach seemed to bring with him. And I also talked to those who might be hurt by his presence. A Black, there was a Holocaust survivor, a imam of a small local mosque. So the potential villains. And then I top to bottom, side to side, interviewed people just to try and get a pulse on through what eyes would such a man be seen? Is there an appetite for fascism in such an otherwise beautiful area with good people? Could it happen here? And looking at emotions turned out to be the thing to do.
And what did you discover, Arlie?
But they said, well, first of all, that this Matthew Heimbach was on the spectrum. And in the course of my knowing him, he changed his mind. And he turned out to be that Pikeville turned out to be a trial run for a far more violent uh, uh, march in Charlottesville, Virginia, only 3 months later. So Pikeville was the trial run. And I noticed in my interviews with Heimbach that he would say, oh, I have German heritage on my father's side and Southern heritage on my mother's side, and I will not be shamed. Somehow he's raising this voice that I will be proud and I will aggress against the shamers. Already heard that in his narrative. And then I discovered that the townspeople were disinterested in Matthew Heimbach. And they said to me, well, our grandfathers, you see those graves on the hills, we decorate them Memorial Day because they fought against fascism. We're not for fascism. But the book talks about another parade, and that is for someone that they were taken with, that having given up on regular government, here came a figure by the name of Donald Trump who saw them, they felt, and understood their grievance. Meanwhile, the left was laughing at them and not seeing them. They didn't feel understood. Democratic Party seemed to be putting others ahead of them, gays, women, and had forgotten about social class and loss. And so this Donald Trump had appeal. And while they said no to Matthew Heimbach, they said yes to Donald Trump.
Why did you focus primarily on men in this book?
It's funny, many of my previous books have focused on women. But I think I'm interested in who's in trouble and getting them out of trouble. And I think men are in a crisis, white men and Black men. But for example, here at UC Berkeley, only 43% of undergraduates are men. And I'm wondering, where are the others? Why aren't they sitting in those chairs and learning? So I think the basic story is that they've taken an economic hit, and certainly blue collar men, and that's the big story here. 42% of Americans blue collar. and white. And they, one man explained the crisis well to me. And our interview began with his saying, "Oh, I'm trailer trash, okay?" And I said, "Well, what do you mean?" And he described his family. He said, "We've been poor. I'm on uh, disability myself, and we live. I grew up with the drugs all around me and frightened of any knock at the door. And I'm used to being described as dumb hillbilly." And so he said this: America has two primary narratives. One is of the successful uh, middle class guy, talking guy, and they say, "Well, good for you. You've had a good job, and I can support your family. You're a success. You have the American dream." And then America looks at a poor Black man and says, "Well, you didn't get the American dream, but that's because of racism. And we understand that." That's that narrative. What about a guy like me, he said, who's poor and male and white? There's no explanation for this. I don't have the American dream, and it must be because I'm lazy or I'm down. So eh, he felt anguished, and he wasn't for Donald Trump, but he wasn't for the Democratic Party either. He felt stuck in the middle. And I think Americans of good spirit, you know, on the Democratic side should understand him and reach out to him and say, hey, we do understand. Uh, and that has been, I think, a missing piece of the Democratic Party for a while now. The whole, they're not looking at social class, and they need to.
We'll talk about what the Democrats should do more of moving forward in a moment, but you make an interesting observation in your book about how Republicans view success and really conversely poverty, and how Democrats view success. In other words, you talk about Republicans inadvertently blaming poor people because they don't have the pull them up by the bootstraps mentality. And as a result, people in red states blame themselves, while Democrats focus on the big picture and say, it's not your fault, it's society's fault.
Exactly. It's a kind of a pride paradox, we could say, that, and it's poignant, that those who have suffered the hit economically are also those who subscribe to individualism. And so they're likely to say, look, if I make it, that's credit to me. And if I fail, that's my fault. That's my shame. Whereas people in blue states are not taking such an economic hit, are more likely to have a circumstantial culture of pride and say, "Oh, well, circumstances were wrong. It's not me personally that's caused my own failure." So they're less likely to beat themselves up.
That's compounded by this distrust or inability to accept the government's help, right? So you have people blaming themselves and thinking that government should not get involved in their lives, at least financially, or helping them. So it seems to me this has all the makings of a massive shame spiral for these people in red states.
That's right. And I heard unemployed coal miner's wife saying, when we had to go on food stamps, we'd shop at a different store because we didn't want to be seen with the food stamps. And here's the paradox again. Democrats often say, well, look, Democratic states actually are richer, but they give money that ultimately goes to the red states. Um, and so 40%, for example, of Kentucky state budget comes from the government, and most of that tax revenue comes from richer, that is, blue states. And so the Democrats say, well, why aren't you grateful? We've given you something indirectly. And that's not seeing how it felt to walk into the store and to see the eyes on you as you pull out your stamps and to think, well, I must have done something wrong on the failure here. So, in order to get to not deny, I began, saying, look, we need to lift the veil and think of feelings in order to see what's really going on the other side. And that's an example of a painful feeling that we need to understand.
I want to read something from your book because I think it so clearly illustrates what you're talking about. You write, so what happens, I wondered, when workers are exhorted to believe that capitalism needs no government hand and that each individual working in it bears personal responsibility for how well or poorly he or she fares, and then companies pull out? Those left behind find themselves trapped inside a pride paradox. Of course, I'll say this parenthetically, you're referring to these centers where manufacturing got hollowed out and plants moved to either like non-union states or overseas. And I think this quote really describes how people felt. Shame comes gradually. Let me give you an example of guys around where I live. First thing, a guy gets his layoff slip and he blames the inspector, then the supervisor. Then he shakes his fists at the Obama administration for putting in the Clean Air Act and adds in Biden and the Democratic Party and the deep state. Then, when his unemployment runs low and his wife asks for money for groceries for the kids, he faces a hard choice. If you need money and don't have a degree, you've got to leave. But his family's here and he doesn't want to leave. That's when he starts to feel bad about himself. He looks around at the jobs on that are offering at sorry, he looks around at the jobs at 9 or 10.50 an hour and he turns his nose up at what he thinks of as girly service jobs because he can't support his family on that kind of money. But then his partner says, "We need to feed the kids." So he takes the crap job and she says, "There's still not enough money for food, gas, and fixing the roof." It's then that his shame begins to get stronger because now he feels the problem is on him. And if he leaves on Route 23 looking for work and comes back empty handed, that's shame waiting for him at home. Then, if he gets into drugs, take it from me, he's ashamed. That can lead to divorce and separation from his kids, and now he's on the dole. He always felt superior to others he saw on the dole, and now he's on it too. So he's ashamed about that and mad that he's made to feel ashamed. Then he may read some op ed in the Appalachian News Express calling people like him a deadbeat for not supporting his family and paying taxes the town needs for its sewer repair. He's not a contributor. On top of all that, he sees on the internet people outside the region firing insults at him as ignorant, racist, sexist, or homophobic. Now he's mad at the shamers. And by this point, he's forgotten about the shame. He's just plain pissing mad. Doesn't that say it all?
That's James Browning. Yeah, a 12-year heroin addict recovering. And when I met him, he was homeless and in a drug recovery center. And he had just graduated from it. And 12 years of heroin. He had overdosed 4 times. I've talked to him over the last 6, 7 years, and some in Zoom, and I've talked to his sister who rescued him. He's an amazing, eye-opening person. And
So how old is he now, Arlie?
he's 43, and I just talked to him yesterday. And you know what he told me about denial? As I was telling him, I think both left are denying things, but different things. And he said, the thing about denial is that you don't know that you are denying something. I love this insight. And he's trying to help us lift our denial. And I'm doing it by giving my reader this man. And so what happens then if you have half the population that doesn't understand that story or passes over it or doesn't see its significance because they're not looking at feelings? Then you have the situation we're in.
You know, I've done a lot of reading and reporting on loneliness and the epidemic of loneliness in this country. And I have this thesis, and it's probably not original, that a lot of people gravitate to these groups because they want to belong. And it doesn't matter what group they're joining, they just want to feel a part of something. And as church attendance and community activities have declined, and Kiwanis clubs and all those things that used to be gathering places for people are not as active or accessible, that people are joining these groups, and then they have the foundation of grievance and loss. It's almost a replacement for community.
I love your thesis, Katie. I think it's right on. I mean, it's really brilliant. And
Was probably your thesis that I just stole.
no, no, it's yours. And I think it's another way, and if we take the blinders off, what's going on hope the other side, it makes it understandable. Um, and with this, instead of the Kiwanis Club or the bowling club, we do know that downward mobility goes with a loss of community and more people living alone and in worse health. So put all that together with this newfound community uh, in politics, where there's kind of it's a petri dish for rancor and complaint and blaming. You know, we the shamed are blaming together collectively how fun it is, and there's kind of a euphoria getting rid of the blame and being proud together. It's a new and scary form of community, but is a response, I think, to loss.
How did you
So
get people to open up to you, Arlie? I mean, you're a woman about my age, maybe a couple years older.
older. Yeah.
You are, from Berkeley. Was it hard for you to get people to trust you, to open up to you, to tell you their stories, and to share their shame?
You know, no, it wasn't hard. And I think you're the same kind of person as I am. Um, it takes a little at first, and then you're two people, and you're sitting down, and I'm really interested to get to know their story. And um, I think what it takes is first you get your alarm system off, and then if there are stereotypes to deal with, you deal with them. Like one guy said, "Oh, you're from Berkeley, California." Whoa. And well, people look down on us, us done hillbillies like that. And people have stereotypes of us. And I said, yeah, people have stereotypes about people that come from Berkeley, California, too. Um, so there was a laugh at that. And then I shared that my grandma grew up on a dairy farm in Maine, and I was hoeing the garden and loved it. But, those broccoli really need tending. And they say, well, we, you know, we're ridiculed for our accents, our Southern accents. And I said, well, my father had a very strong Boston accent. He used to call me Arlie. That's heard my name. I'm used to it being Arlie now. So we're in the same ball wax. It's not so different. Um, like that.
I think a lot of people could learn from taking your approach. I guess the question I wanted to close with a couple questions. I do think that people who have college degrees have been condescending to a lot of these people. I think it's less about their income and more that they believe, to your earlier point, that blaming immigrants, blacks, women for their troubles is just racism and sexism and xenophobia. Did you find people how did you come to understand if people were that way? And did you forgive them for those attitudes?
Um, yes, there are things I heard um, that I personally disagree with. And um, going in, I tell people, look, we're not going to agree on a lot of things. That's not why I'm here to tell you what I believe. I'm really here because I think a lot of people on the Democratic side of America aren't listening and don't get to know you.
Or
So,
don't understand?
yes, that's right. And I guess what I would add to that is that on the left, there are prejudices against, uh, men, against white men, and that we need to look again and dismantle. In other words, they feel like a minority group. I know it sounds strange, but
Well,
uh,
they feel like they've been the
downwardly
subject
mobile
of
white men feel,
well, they feel like they've been the target of reverse racism, they would say. In fact, many of them told you that, right?
they did, they did. So I think it's time for people on the left to take their alarm system off, to actually uh, eat a little humble pie, uh, because I don't think we can go ahead without making new openings and building new empathy bridges uh, to a group that's been ignored. And that's pretty major. And I think in the days ahead, uh, we need to actually start, once we catch our breath, to build new empathy bridges to portions of the white working class. I don't think it would be hard to do. And there are many ways in which Donald Trump is far more extreme than his followers. And those would be issues on which we could get common ground. For example, climate change. There a majority of Republicans, fair majority of Republicans, strong majority of Democrats agree that the government should uh, spend money in remediating climate change. They don't agree on the causes of it, but they do agree on something should be done about it. bare majority of Republicans, strong majority of Democrats agree that children in school should learn about climate change and the dangers of it. So that's crossover territory. I think prison reform, you would find quite a lot of cross-party agreement, and reproductive rights. Uh, rather than um, kind of settling for judgment, we should realize that we've actually been in denial about a whole social shift that has led a lot of Americans to become predisposed to a charismatic leader that's with great promises of a new day. And it's happening not just in America, it's happening actually around the world. In this last election, there's been a giant move away from incumbent governments toward right-wing governments. So, we shouldn't just say, oh, what did Kamala do wrong here and there? Okay, we should do those appraisals, but um, there's a larger set of forces, and I think that's what these last two books, especially my last one, Strangers, to tune into the circumstances and then the feelings that those circumstances make people feel.
I was going to say the first step is obviously understanding, but the second step, I don't know, I'm very solution oriented person. And since your book is called Stolen Pride, Lost Shame, and the Rise of the Right, I guess my final question to you, Arlie, is how do we collectively as a nation restore pride to some of these towns and some of these people?
Yeah. Uh, well, I think by making clear that left and right share, first of all, the goal of restoring pride. We get it. We want it. That's the first thing to do. And in doing that first thing, we have to realize that actually people on the left are less good at listening across the partisan divide. Uh, Recent research found that um, people on the liberal left are more likely to break off contact with people that say something they disagree with than are people on the right. Whites are more likely to do it than blacks. So, paradox is that research also shows that conservatives are more likely to soften their positions if they get to meet somebody face to face and sit down and get to know them personally. So we need to break that impasse for starters, uh, and then search the kinds of issues in which we could come to some common agreement. I met a lot of people in these deep red communities who were for renewable energy. One big MAGA um, leader pointed to me, he said, "All those sawed-off mountains there, we need some windmills on there, windmills." So that's a Biden, Build Back Better and uh, Inflation Reduction Act kind of measures are paying for that kind of thing. So he doesn't kind of acknowledge it or kind of know it, but one could say, hey, that's a good idea. We should have windmills. So get rid of the shaming, blaming, and on with solutions on which both sides would happily agree. I think that's the way to go. And just being a bystander is not the way to go. We all need to participate now. It's serious what we're facing.
I kept thinking about Brian Stevenson, and my team is so sick of me fawning over Brian Stevenson, but he talks about the need to be proximate. And I think the fact that there's not much commingling between people who live in urban centers and people who live in more rural communities
Right.
um, is part of the problem, that we just don't know people who are really that different from us.
Right.
And we all are in our little bubbles, and I think those need to be penetrated from both sides.
We used to have labor unions that were basically the middleman between the working class and the Democratic Party, but those got undercut by offshoring. And
And by greedy corporations, I should add. But although I know unions sometimes get out of control, and I have arguments with friends about unions and, if they're corrupt and they overreach, but I also think they're so important to protect people from greedy corporations who just care about quarterly profits and the bottom line and pleasing their shareholders, right?
that's right. And the terrible thing is, the more we don't have things like unions that ameliorate people's lives, the more distressed they are, the more emotionally open to charismatic leaders. So we need to break the cycle. And yeah, it can be
My
done.
daughter my daughter reminded me of an FDR fireside chat that he gave about the key to stability is really economic prosperity for everyone.
Yeah,
And if you don't have that, or there's such a huge chasm between the haves and have-nots, that is a recipe for terrible unrest and social instability
right.
and worse. So um, yeah, I think that we need to figure out how to make everyone feel like they have a chance to just have a good life and create, stability for their families and for their children.
Right. And that just pointing to an enemy, you know, the intruder, the immigrant, uh, the black, the woman, is not a real solution. I think we need to get new channels across this political divide, um, to stop that blaming and get um, some faith back, some real community back in America.
Well, we'll see if that can happen. I think your book is a great start for people to read, because I think what you do is humanize people. And I think so many groups have been dehumanized in our current culture, whether you're talking about immigrants, or you're talking about Black Americans, or you're talking about poor white men in rural communities. And I think to give them a name and a face and to tell their stories is really critically important for us to better understand what's going on and try to fix it. Arlie, it's been such a pleasure talking to you. I really enjoyed I really enjoyed meeting you, and I love your work. And I'm going to recommend it to all my friends who are scratching their heads and trying to understand what's going on in this country of ours.
Thank you, Katie. You do wonderful work too.
Well,
Really
thanks.
appreciate the chance to talk with you.